Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is not only a colleague, but is very much a friend, Dr. Abigail Jacobson. Abigail is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She published a number of works, two important books. The first one, From Empire to Empire, Jerusalem Between Ottoman and British Rule, that goes back to 2011. But more importantly, a second book, which was published together with another scholar, Moshe Maor, Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in Mandatory in Palestine, which was published in 2016. Now, the long list of articles I'm not going to mention. Many of them do focus on Jerusalem, particularly on the topic and in the periods of World War I, but we will talk about them. But in the meantime, first of all, Abigail, welcome.
Hi, Roberto. Thank you for having me.
So the first question that I'll obviously ask all my guests is, Abigail, what is your Jerusalem? What is your connection with the city?
So that's an interesting question for me because I never lived in Jerusalem. Even now, when I teach at the Hebrew University, I don't live in Jerusalem. The city for me is very stressful, and I feel actually very foreign in it. I always did, by the way. I remember as a PhD student, when I was working on my dissertation, I took the bus from Tel Aviv, where I live, to Jerusalem. And when I got off the bus, as I was approaching the central bus station, I always felt the urge of pulling out my passport. That's, an indication of how foreign I felt. And then when I left the city, I always felt a sense of relief. It's interesting because the topic of my dissertation and then the book was about the city of Jerusalem in a very interesting point in time. And one would think, or one could think, that I'm in love with the city. So I'm actually in love with the city's history, not so much with the current atmosphere and realities in the city and what it represents today. But it is a fascinating place, a place which one can discover, new things every minute and every day. And every time I walk around the city, or either with someone who is very well familiar or is a local, or with guests coming from abroad, I always see different things that surprise me, that are strange for me, that are unfamiliar. So it's a city full of surprises, but my feelings towards it are very, very ambivalent and very, very strange, actually. Definitely, I don't feel like a local in this city.
I had the same feeling many times, just to visit and feel like a stranger. And I am a stranger indeed. And I realized that I'm in love with the history of a city, and particularly at the moment, and I'm teaching a course on the history of Jerusalem. But one thing is to be in love with the history, and one thing is to actually, understand and love the city as it is 21st century. Which brings me to ask a question about how do you see the city from the hill of Hebrew University? Because Hebrew University is this location that had been even some sort of an island, particularly in the years between 1948 and 67, when the city was divided, and always had some sort of a sense of isolation from the rest of Jerusalem. And I was wondering, what's the view from there?
So that's a good question. I'm located, the Hebrew University has 4 different campuses, and I'm in one of them, in the Mount Scopus campus, which is, as you said, for many years was very, geographically isolated from the rest of the city between 49 and 67. Today, obviously, it's an integrated part of the city, but in many ways, I feel that as a campus and for the students, it is still very isolated from the rest of the city. So the Mount Scopus campus is located on the margins of the western city and the eastern city. Let's say from some windows you can see all the holy sites, the old city, and on the other side of campus, when you walk around and approach the eastern side of the campus, you can actually see the desert, the Judea desert, in a good day until the Dead Sea. But you can also see the eastern neighborhoods of the Palestinian eastern neighborhoods of the city, and the Palestinian areas which are located behind the wall, behind the separation wall. So, for example, Isawiya and Shoafat refugee camp, which is actually part of Jerusalem. And for me, walking around on campus, it's a very, very interesting experience. Also driving around campus, there is an interesting road that kind of surrenders, that in which you can actually, drive around and see, drive from the western part, see the western part, and then Mount of Olives, and then going on all the way to the desert and Isawiya, French Hill, and then back to Mount Scopus in a way. And it's an interesting tour that I think also shows or demonstrates the different facets and the voices and people that are based and are seen in the campus itself, because the Hebrew University campus today is full of students, obviously, but it's full of the student population is very, very heterogeneous and very diverse. And among the students you find, for example, many Palestinians from East Jerusalem who are taking part in a special program that is run for the last, I would say, 5-6 years by the Hebrew University, a program that, according to which those Palestinian students are admitted to a preparatory year, and then they can be admitted to the university based on their tawjihi grades, not on their final 12 grades exams at the Hebrew system, at the Israeli system. So they can be admitted on based on their tawjihi grades, which brings in quite a lot of Palestinian, of East Jerusalemites students who are spread and study all over in the different campuses. I think there are many of them in our campus. Every year, I think there are around 400 students who are admitted to the university altogether. So on the one hand, you see many Palestinians from East Jerusalem. On the other hand, you see many soldiers and many soldiers and policemen who are participating in special programs funded by the army or by the police. And they are walking around campus with uniform, wearing uniform. And then you have all the other students, which are, of course, the usual diverse population, student population of Israel or in Israeli institutions. Everyone, like Jews, Palestinian Arabs from the north, religious, secular, etc., etc. So that's a very diverse student population. And for me, as a teacher and as a scholar working at the university, it's quite challenging to teach in such a diverse setting. It's challenging, but I'm up to the challenge, and the university itself is trying to be up to the challenge. There is a lot of emphasis on diversity and different plans and different programs and projects that deal with diversity. And there's a special diversity. There's one of the vice presidents of the university deals with diversity issues, and I think that the main issue here is that despite the very diverse student population, still the different groups are very remote from each other. It's very, very hard to bring together the Israeli and the Palestinian students, for example. It's very, very hard, of course, obviously, to bring together the soldiers and some of the Israeli students, even not to mention, of course, the Palestinian students. So when I stand in class, I can definitely see like blocks of students, like the soldiers block, the East Jerusalemite block, the secular block, the religious block, you know, and my challenge, one of my challenges as a teacher and as a lecturer, is also to try and bridge between those different groups and make them communicate with each other, speak with each other, learn about each other, while bearing in mind the sensitivities and the big sensitivities and the big difficulties and challenges that they have communicating with each other. And of course, needless to say, questions of power relations, which is something that really is very central in my perception of when I walk around campus and realize and talk with students. Questions of power relations, of course, are very central. So in that sense, I think that Mount Scopus is still some kind of an isolated place in the city in general. Like, it brings together all these different people. All of them, or many of them, live in the city or live around the city, but the different communities are still, function in isolation. They don't communicate and they don't get in touch with each other as much as I would like them to. And then, of course, there are those students, those Israeli students or Jewish Israeli students who are, who have never been, or who choose to completely ignore the setting of East Jerusalem or the realities which they see or they can look at and view from the different windows of different halls at the university. They choose not to look at them. They choose not to study them. They choose not to confront them, those realities. And that's, again, another challenge that I'm trying to overcome with my students as a scholar working at this particular campus.
I guess it's hard to ignore, not to see the wall itself. I mean, as a visitor of Hebrew University, there is this kind of like shocking punch in your belly the moment you reach the top and you turn and you gaze, standing in front of a gate, you turn left and you see the wall, and it's right there in front of you. So I guess it becomes it's a choice, as you said. It's an act of choosing not to see what's going on in there. But I was wondering about the question of Sheikh Jarrah, which is obviously very contemporary, very important, which is literally, for those who don't know, is literally 5 minutes away. It's just downhill and then uphill the other side. And so I was wondering to what extent the current events in Sheikh Jarrah are actually influencing Mount Scopus, or if Mount Scopus is again sort of shielded from the events that are occurring just a few minutes away.
So Sheikh Jarrah is just one among different events and different conflicts that are taking place and took place in the city since I've been at the Hebrew University. They don't influence the life and realities at the university directly, but of course they influence the degree of tension at some points. Not so much as Sheikh Jarrah, but last year's war in May that took place in May was much more influential and got into the campus very radically and very strongly, because people on both sides were very much affected and traumatized by the different events taking place in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, in the mixed, in parentheses, in quotation marks, towns, cities, Lida, Haifa, Akko, other places. So these events were much more traumatized and were much more traumatic, and I think I felt influenced day-to-day realities at the university. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood that is, as you said, is located literally like 5 minutes drive from Mount Scopus. And there are students at the university who are very active in the Save Sheikh Jarrah movements and other movements taking place as part of the conflict over Sheikh Jarrah. But again, in my experience, it affected life in campus much less than last year's events in May.
Now, before moving and talk about the history of Jerusalem, but I'm curious about something, since you have this kind of experience that goes across, neighborhoods, areas, obviously students, education. The last two, since now Israel is reopening the borders to all travelers, including non-vaccinated, apparently, I was actually curious about what was your experience teaching in that corner of Jerusalem during COVID. How did it play out, the outbreak of a pandemic, and also, connected to it, the relationship with your students, whether, from Israel, and particularly those from East Jerusalem?
Well, first of all, part of COVID was during, as the rest of the world, we taught on Zoom for a long time. But when we came back to campus, it was interesting because we taught in a hybrid way. So I was teaching in campus, but I also opened Zoom so that I can still accommodate those students who are not vaccinated or who can't come to campus, etc. And then, of course, again, the kind of the isolation or the divisions between the different groups that I mentioned earlier came into play, because many of the Palestinian students did not show up in campus, and they were on Zoom, but they closed their cameras. Their cameras were shut off with no video, so no one could see them. And that's because of different reasons: poor internet connection, lack of working space, you name it. Again, some things that the Israeli students didn't understand and were kind of asking, why don't we see the Palestinian students? And I had to explain to them, and that was part of me trying also to expose them to the realities in East Jerusalem, this geographical area that is so close, but then again so far away from them, right, mentally. So many of those Palestinian students haven't been to campus until this year. So for 2 years, basically haven't studied face to face. Hopefully at the end, we're now still on vacation, but hopefully when we get back to school in 2 weeks or so, everyone will show up in campus again. But the experience, I think, again, of teaching on Zoom and studying on Zoom is very, very different for Jewish Israelis and for Palestinians from East Jerusalem. These are two different realities, totally different challenges that students are facing.
Well, let's move to history. The current situation is rather complex and grim, I would say, and perhaps with no real solution. But certainly is refreshing to see that there are people like yourself trying to at least explain and sort of engage with that from a different perspective. So your first work was very much on Jerusalem during the period of World War I, which obviously intersects very much with mine. And perhaps it's worth mentioning that we got to know each other because someone in the middle, a previous guest of a podcast, Michel Campos, bumped into myself at the archives in Jerusalem. And all of a sudden we had this frenzy of like, oh my gosh, there are two people working on the same topic, lucky us, from very different perspectives. But we obviously share the interest in Jerusalem during the period of World War I and the late Ottoman era. And I was just wondering if you can give us a sense briefly about your work, your previous work on Jerusalem, about this idea of from empire to empire, why and how Jerusalem changed as a city from one empire to another. And I remember very much also you coined this sentence, and which also is an idea about a city changing hands.
Yes, so I'll just start by saying that the story of this project was born, basically, the seed was born from a very basic question that I asked myself back in my days at Chicago when I was doing my PhD in Chicago at the University of Chicago. I asked myself what's basically changed in the life of people, of Jerusalemites, of Jerusalem residents, in the morning of, let's say, December 12 or December 13, 1917, a day or two after General Allenby entered the city, this very, very heroic, famous entry from the Jaffa Gate, and basically in that moment, in this symbolic moment, basically occupied the city and ended 400 years of Ottoman rule in that city. And my very basic question was, okay, so suddenly on that day, Jerusalem changed hands, right? Practically, symbolically, historically, you name it, from one empire to the other, right? I mean, from the Ottoman Empire, from 400 years of Ottoman rule into suddenly the British rule of the infidels, etc., you name it, and colonial rule, very foreign Christian rule. And what happened? How did it affect and how did it influence the life, the realities, the ways of thinking of people in the city? So that was basically the seed of what became a dissertation and later became a book. And through this work, what I tried to do, the project was actually twofold. One was to try to work on or to write a history of a social history of World War I within the realms of Jerusalem. So a micro history in a way of the city of Jerusalem during the war, social and urban history of a city facing a huge crisis of different kinds. But the emphasis would be on a social history of World War I, which is something that hasn't been done too much until that point, historiographically, in Middle Eastern studies, of course. And the second project was, or the second side of this project was to write the history of the mixed city of Jerusalem. So to look at Jerusalem as a mixed locale, bringing in the picture as many of its voices, residents, and sources, primary sources as much as possible, and trying to look or write a history of a thick history of Jerusalem as much as possible in this transition period between the Ottoman and the British empires. And by this, I was also trying to question and challenge the periodization that we're so used to, the periodization of, we are so used to look at Ottoman Palestine and mandatory Palestine. And we never ask, okay, but how did this transition, how did this process of transitioning from one empire to the other actually take place? So in one of the chapters of the book, as you know, that chapter was entitled "When a City Changes Hands," because it was literally changing hands. But what did it mean to change hands? How did it affect the residents? How did it affect the psychic? How did it affect identity questions? Did people all of a sudden stop thinking about themselves as Ottomans and started thinking about themselves as British or under British Empire? Or what were they thinking? How did they envision themselves and their realities and the changing realities? So that was a project that was in a way very brought into the picture different questions from different kind of sub-disciplines and areas of interest of mine: urban history, social history, the whole question of intercommunal relations. This is when I started becoming very, very interested also in the topic of Sephardi studies and Sephardi identity and Ottomanism and Ottoman identity, Zionism, all these isms and ideologies and identities that were around, and how did they all, coexisted? If they coexisted, how did they all live together? Sometimes in one people's mind.
I was always fascinated by this idea of transitioning, this idea of one day you go to bed and, there's one regime ruling a place, and the day after you wake up and actually that's gone, and there's a new group of people coming in, and it's real, it's happening. I guess to an extent we experienced that with COVID, like we were living our life, and then all of a sudden we said, well, you need to be home, and then that changed really. But it's, in a way, that was much more dramatic and certainly life-changing event, particularly with the surrender itself of Jerusalem. That brings me to ask you a couple of questions. In the last 15 years, maybe 20 years, we certainly saw a great number of works being published, but also more public history, talking about this period in time, sort of revising our understanding of Jerusalem in the late Ottoman era, in the period of World War I. And I was wondering if you feel like there's still anything missing about that period that we don't know, that maybe historians should investigate more, or do you feel like, well, we have a good deal now of a better understanding of a city in that period of time?
I think that the history of Jerusalem in general has been covered quite well during those years. Of course, with your work, with my work, with Michelle's work, with
Salim Tamari, Sam Nassar. I mean, we can name it like quite a few, Louis,
exactly, a whole group
so
of people who have been working on Jerusalem during those years. I think what is missing about the history of Jerusalem, and this is something that I'm trying to touch upon now, me and some other scholars, is actually the period after 1948. Which is a fascinating period as well, the period of the divided city. But if you're asking me specifically about World War I would say I actually think that there's a lot to be done still about the war, but not in Jerusalem. Maybe in other cities, maybe in other regions in Palestine, Eretz Israel, the rural areas. There's a lot to be done. I mean, wars in general, I find, are fascinating and bring in fascinating questions, especially when you try to approach them from the social point of view, cultural point of view, questions that have to do really with the way people are functioning during the war, surviving the war. So I think that with World War I, there's a lot to be done, but not necessarily on Jerusalem itself. And again,
I guess another point I wanted to ask you is very much about sources available. I mean, I remember you unpacked, the diary of this Jerusalemite, Isan Turjman, which changed, the work of many people, and certainly have become like, a very important feature in understanding what was going on in the city, and also in terms of intercommunal relations that were unfolding in the city itself throughout the war period. And I was just wondering if you can give us a sense of, who was Isan Turjman, how you got into the diary, how did it change your perspective over the history of the city, looking at this particular diary?
So the diary of Isan Turjman was one of the treasures, definitely, of my one of the main findings, or the findings that I was most proud of in my research. And I ran into it completely by chance, following a footnote in late Yoshua Porat's book, where he mentioned in passing, a diary of a Muslim soldier who served in the Ottoman headquarters in Jerusalem during World War I, and leading and is kept in the manuscript department of the National Library at the Hebrew University. And I was very, very excited to run into this footnote, and I immediately, of course, ran to the library, rushed to the library to find this fascinating diary, 196 pages long, handwritten, very hard to decipher, written in a pseudonym of Adel Salah. It was Salim Tamari, Professor Salim Tamari, who figured the history of the writer, of the author of the diary, and they revealed the fact that the real diarist is Ihsan Turjman. And but I was lucky enough to actually hold the diary in my hands and start working on it, and I ended up writing almost a whole chapter based only on this account, which was absolutely fascinating. Like to think about this particular source methodologically. What does it mean to analyze a person's diary when he never intended this diary to become public or found? Obviously, never imagined that it would end up in the Jewish National University Library at Givat Ram in Israel. So it also, other than the actual findings and what I read in the diary and what I discovered, just the methodological questions were fascinating for me and forced me to think very critically about how to analyze such a source and how to make use of it. And yes, as you said, the diary is now very famous. Again, thanks to Salim Tamari's work on it and the transliteration and publication of the diary. So I used it when it was really raw, really a kind of a raw material.
Yeah, I suppose one of the probably steps is to, again, try to find more and more material coming from that period of time, not just in Jerusalem, but from all of Palestine, which I'm pretty sure all of these treasures are hidden somewhere, but still need to be found. I want to ask you something about, again, the period of the war. You've wrote extensively about the question of humanitarianism. You recently also published an article which doesn't really cover the war, but goes a little bit beyond about the American colony. And so I was just wondering, what was going on in Jerusalem in terms of relief and this idea of humanitarianism. So, the organization of help towards communities in Jerusalem.
So there's a vast literature about humanitarianism, of course. Keith Wittenpau and others have written extensively about it. What I did in my first project was to look at the humanitarian projects during the war itself, and I was trying to see again whether the different humanitarian or relief work were based on specific communities, or whether they were cross-communal, whether there were some projects that were organized by the by Jerusalem municipality or by the Ottoman authorities, or whether each community had its own kind of network and relief projects and work that has been done. So that was that part of the work. The work that you mentioned on the American colony is in a way different, because it brings into the picture. First of all, it's on a slightly different period. It's the historical context is right after World War I, and it's a project that is based on two albums, photo albums, which were produced and found at the library, or it's the archive of the American colony in Jerusalem, and at the Library of Congress. And that work was fascinating for me from other reasons. It was fascinating because it introduced questions of humanitarianism, the way they are presented over photo albums, and how photography plays an important role in different humanitarian projects within the city of Jerusalem, but also outside of the city of Jerusalem. And the context was the two photo albums, the documents, which was operated in the American colony by the American colony in Jerusalem, and that hosted girls many of whom were victims of the war, whose families abandoned them, who were found on the streets, who were dropped by the footsteps of the American colony. And these are stories that we are familiar with regarding the war. So these are girls who actually survived the war and were raised for several years in the orphanage of the American colony. And the albums really kind of document the life of the girls and the work that is being done by the orphanage and by the American colony. And it's targeting the donors that are contributing or donating money to support the girls and to support this institution. So the question of humanitarianism and humanitarian aid, the whole discourse about humanitarianism is taking a different shape there in that particular project that I wrote.
And I just want to remind that there is an episode that I recorded with Rachel Lev, who is the archivist of the American Colony Collection, which at the moment I think it's closed due to financial reasons, but it's an amazing photographic collection that really gives us a sense of a Jerusalem that for many probably is completely unknown and neglected, but it does exist and it's available. And more importantly, it's accessible.
Let me take this opportunity to give a huge credit and shout out to Rachel Lev, the archivist and the curator of the American Colony Archive. And the American Colony Collection in Jerusalem offers not only a huge, is not only a treasure in terms of the photography products of the American Photography Department of the colony, but also in other ways as well. The American Colony was an amazing institution that was engaged in many, many things, many projects in the city. An unusual institution that I think its history is yet to be told and needs to be told. And of course, the fact that the archive is now closed is a pity. And I hope it will change sooner rather than later, because it's a real treasure for historians and for people who are eager to learn more about the history of the city and of this institution in particular.
Yeah, some people may only think about the American Colony as the hotel, but there's definitely more than that.
Definitely more than just the hotel.
I just want to move to your to more contemporary work, and I'm aware that you are currently working on something with your co-author of the book Oriental Neighbors about Musrara. But let me take a step back. So Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in mandatory Palestine. Can you just briefly give us a sense of what the book is about, and also why it turned out to be so controversial, particularly its translation in Hebrew?
The book is, first of all, I just want to emphasize that this book was co-authored by me and Dr. Moshe Naor from the University of Haifa, Department of Israel History. And so it's totally a joint project of both of us, which was an amazing attempt to work together, and we're still working together, and it was so much fun, really, and is so much fun to work together. The book is about the history and the relations between Jews coming from the Middle East, Oriental Jew, we can call them Oriental Jews, we can call them local Jews, we can call them Arab Jews. They call themselves in different ways and names, and we try to follow those names. So between Oriental Jews and Arabs who lived in mandatory Palestine. In a way, our departing point is the late Ottoman period, when Sephardi Jews, Oriental Jews held a very important political role within the Ottoman, within the local Ottoman administration, since they were the representatives of the Jewish millet. Unlike the Ashkenazi Jews, who were not representatives of the Jewish millet and did not hold Ottoman citizenship, mostly. And when the empires changed, going back to the other project, when the empire changed and all of a sudden the British colonial period started, the balance of power within the Jewish community has changed as well. And those previously Ottoman citizenship Sephardi Jews had to find themselves a new political project in a way, and to revive their political power. And one of the ways of doing that was by trying to situate themselves as mediators, what we argue as many mediators between the Jewish and the Arab community, and especially between the Zionist movement and the labor Zionist establishment composed of mainly Ashkenazi Jews and the Arab community in Palestine. And the book, which is divided into 5 chapters, each of the chapters deals with a different field of investigation. So we have the political forms of mediation, political mediations, which were not at all homogeneous, and the different voices were trying to bring into the picture the different voices, political voices and perceptions that were heard and the different activists and organizations that were in the scene. And then we have a chapter about cultural and linguistic and cultural, I would say, mediation through the realms of newspapers and books and studying of Arabic, Amiya and Fusha, colloquial Arabic and standard Arabic, and then a chapter about living in the life in the mixed cities and in the Oriental, what we call Oriental ghettos, and in the margins of the mixed cities, such as the neighborhood of Manshie and the Yemenite neighborhood in the margins of Tel Aviv and Jaffa, Har El Yahud in Haifa and other neighborhoods. So trying to locate the ways in which people were, Oriental Jews were crossing between one world to the other, between the Orient and the Arab culture and Arabic language and the Ashkenazi white city in the case of Tel Aviv. And then another chapter that deals with the phenomena of mistarvim, or of Jews who were employed by the paramilitary groups, especially Haganah and Palmach, Etzel Lehi, to work as in gathering intelligence, as spies, as terrorists, basically, in many cases, based on their appearance and their black appearance as Arabs, the language they spoke, Arabic, etc. And the idea is really to try and highlight the existence of this group, which hasn't been highlighted enough, we think. Now it's, of course, much more discussed and dealt with, but to highlight the existence and the importance and the centrality and the role of this group of people, of the Oriental Jews, as a very particular, a very, very special and particular group within the history of the conflict, of the Zionist movement, of the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Israel, of the relations between Jews and Arabs. So in general, in very, very large, big terms, this is the project.
And I was wondering, since you're still working with Moshe Naor as your co-author, about this new project that you are developing about the neighborhood of Jerusalem, Musrara.
Yes, so here we are, in a way, it continues part of the, especially one of the chapters in Oriental Neighbors, where we deal with the urban environment. Regarding Musrara, so what we're doing there is we moved into a different period, the later period after between 48 and 67, and we're looking at a neighborhood that is a trapped, we call it a trapped neighborhood, a neighborhood that is trapped or bordered between two borders. One is physical, which is located on the eastern part, the eastern border that separated West Jerusalem from East Jerusalem between 49 and 67, and the western border, which is basically a mental, imagined border between Jerusalem of the new immigrants, the newcomers, the Oriental Jews who lived in Musrara in very, very hard conditions, and West Jerusalem, which was much more, wealthy and was again populated, some of its neighborhoods by Ashkenazi Jews. And our argument and what we're trying to do in this article, in this paper, is to try and locate, first of all, to locate this double border, the eastern physical border versus the western imagined border, try to find out and investigate how these borders were crossed, if they were crossed. And at the end, our conclusion is that the eastern border, even though it was a physical border, a barbed wire, consisted of a barbed wire, a wall that separated the eastern part of the city, Jordanian part of the city, Palestinian part of the city from the western Jewish Israeli part of the city, this border was in many ways much easier to cross than the Western border that actually never really existed and was only an imagined border. But that was the border that separated between the Eastern and Oriental existence of the residents of Musrara, coming mainly from Morocco, Algeria, Iraq, North Africa and the Middle East in general, and the western part of the city, which was again, based in part on German Jews, etc. So we're trying to portray here a neighborhood that is trapped basically between the two borders. And that's a project that is still ongoing in many ways for us and is fascinating. We really enormously enjoyed working on it together again, using new sources for us. And it will hopefully be continued. We still have some ideas on how to develop it further.
I guess, as you mentioned, people living in Musrara had probably much more commonalities with, for instance, Sari Nusseibeh, that in his memoirs is talking about, looking at his house in Musrara, but across the border. And certainly these people share more than certainly with the people in West Jerusalem. I have one last question. Our conversation took different directions, but I was just wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask, but you want to talk about.
I don't know. I mean, I think that the city of Jerusalem is full of surprises, full of untapped sources for historians. I would like to raise, speaking of sources, to raise the awareness of, the big question of what is going to happen with the Jerusalem Municipal Archive, which is an issue that me and other scholars, Noah Rubin, Dr. Noah Rubin, Professor Menachem Klein, and others are very, very concerned about what will happen with this archive, which is a real treasure. So I think that in a way, Jerusalem is yet to be discovered, fully discovered, and maybe it will never be fully discovered. Fascinating city, a city of, lots of wonders and challenges, until today, of course, mysteries and untapped sources that are yet to be explored, and untapped questions that are yet to be asked.
This was Abigail Jacobson, currently senior lecturer in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, author of From Empire to Empire, Jerusalem Between Ottoman and British Rule, published in 2011, and with Moshe Maor, author of Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in Mandatory Palestine. Abigail, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.